Brother Paul.
Thank you, Steve. Good morning, church. Good to see you this morning. I'm sorry, I couldn't help but think when Bo took off crying of a story. It has nothing to do with the lesson this morning. And you know how your mind goes different places, but my mind went to this story of a man one Sunday morning that woke up and he was just crying. He was just crying. And his wife said, "What in the world is the matter?" And he said, "Well, I don't want to go to church." And she said, "Well, what's the problem?" He said, "People aren't helpful. They're not happy. They don't like me. I don't want to go to church." And she said, "Honey, you got to go. You're the preacher." So that's where my mind went this morning. I'm sorry, and I'm sorry, Bo. We all have those things. But anyway, all right, well, good. You laughed, and that's good. Moving forward in life, it's not always easy, is it? The story. Back in the 1950s, Roger Bannister, who represented Great Britain, and John Leland, who represented Australia, were the first two individuals that ran the sub-4-minute mile. They had never run in a race against each other, but the Olympics occurred, and everyone was looking forward to what was called and titled the Miracle Minute. Yet, when you look at the story, it's quite fascinating. John Leland, when the gun sounded, he took off in the lead. And they had to make 4 laps around the track in order for it to register as a mile. And so he ran the front of the pack. The first lap, John Leland was in the lead. The second lap, Leland was still in the lead. Third lap, Leland was still in the lead, and he was leading. He led the whole race. And he came around the final curve, and he turned around. Backwards, he glanced back to see where Bannister was. And when he turned around to his left, Bannister came around him on the right and won the race. And from that, you might say, well, we get many things. From that, we get the idea, don't look back. From that, we get the idea of just keep looking ahead. And from that, we get the idea that the past will get you. Well, there's many lessons to learn from that story, but it's the idea that I want us to look at this morning. I want us to understand that we are where we are because of the past, but we shouldn't let the past hold us back for the future. That's true with all of life, isn't it? We understand that life has its many, many different paths to take. And in life, as we progress through our individual lives, there's intersections in our lives. There's times in which we stop. There's times in which we need to yield. There's times in which we need to speed up. And there's times in which we need to slow down. There's curves. There's difficulties. There's problems. There's heartaches. There's hurts. There's griefs. There's times of disappointment. There's times in which we simply really do have to shake the dust off our feet and move forward. It's important that we understand that in life, we do move forward. That in life, we keep pushing forward. We keep pushing forth to what is in front of us. In Joshua, the 7th chapter and the 8th chapter, if you have your Bibles, you might want to turn there. There's the story that we want to key on this morning, because there are some great points there with regards to don't look back like Leland did. Keep running the race. The story catch us up a little bit before Joshua 7 and then get us into Joshua 7. As Moses has died, the end of what we call the Pentateuch, book of Deuteronomy. Moses has died, and Moses' successor has been picked, and Moses has given him his blessing. His name is Joshua. Joshua is told in Joshua chapter 1, as he's given his commission, to trust in God, that God would always be there for him, that God would never leave him nor forsake him, and that he promises that if he'll follow the will of God, verses 8 and 9, that he'll always have great success. In Joshua chapter 1, verse 9, Joshua begins to get the children of Israel ready because, you see, they've been wandering in the wilderness, and now it's time to go back and take the homeland. It's time to go back and take their rightful place, if you will, to take the place of the land which God had promised to them. And so as Joshua gets them ready to go, he's devised what really, if you look at it from a military standpoint, is a great idea strategy-wise. Because what he's going to do is he's going to cross over the Jordan River just north of the Dead Sea. And he's basically going to cut the land in half. He's going to cut a wide swath, if you will, from east to west. And he's going to cut the land in two, and so thus they couldn't come and help each other. And then he'll overtake all the land as God has promised. You see, the strategy sounds simple, doesn't it? And as Joshua leads the children of Israel, one of the first places they get to is Jericho. And we know the story there of how that they marched around the walls one time a day, and then the seventh time, 6 times very quiet. Seventh time, man, they created a ruckus and the walls fell. Well, you see, it should have. God had promised them the land. God had promised them victory. God had promised to be with them. And so consequently, everything was supposed to go just like that. And in Joshua chapter 7, they get to Ai. Not but just a little bit after their victory with the walls of Jericho, they get to Ai, and before they get there, Joshua sends out a few spies to spy out the land to see how it is. And they come back, and here's what they say: we don't need to send out everybody. We don't need to send out everyone and create this great, if you will, this great test of our strength, and to sap everybody and to make them weak and to make them tired. We'll just send a few. And so it's agreed upon to send some 3,000 soldiers to Ai. Now remember, here's the mindset. God's with us. He'll not leave us nor forsake us. We'll have victory. We'll have success. We did it at Jericho. We're going to do it here at Ai. They send the 3,000 soldiers. They get there. They do not win. They are defeated. And so Joshua then begins to call upon God. What do you mean, God? Why have you done this to us? What have you done? Why? And he begins, it's kind of interesting because he begins his lament to God with this simple admonition. It would have been nice if we had just been happy where we were. Sound familiar? But as he turns his lament more towards an angry speech towards God, God says, hold up there, buddy. You need to know a few things. And so as he tells him what he tells him this. He tells him, you go back and you lead the people, and here's what you do, and you lead the people, and victory will be yours. But there's a problem. The problem is there's sin in the camp, as the old King James says. There's sin in the camp. And that's why you lost. Well, what's the sin? Well, the sin is that there's somebody that took something from when the walls fell down that was not. Because remember, when they were told to march around the walls, they were told to leave everything like it was, just to go on, move on. But God reveals that the reason for their defeat at Ai was that there's sin in the camp, and the sin is that somebody took something that they shouldn't have. And so Joshua gathers the folks together. And as he gathers them together, he begins to go through the tribes. And he gets to a fellow by the name of Achan. And Joshua says, confess what you've done. And Achan says, well, you remember when we was marching around the walls? Yeah, and they all fell down? Yeah. Well, I saw a good Babylonian garment. And I saw a wedge of gold, about 50 shekels, and I saw 200 shekels of silver, and I took them. Joshua, well, the text doesn't say, Joshua probably said, what'd you do that for? Why did you do that? The text doesn't get into all of that. It just simply says, Achan says, it's in the ground underneath the floor of my tent. And someone goes, and sure enough, they find it. And to finish out Joshua, the 7th chapter, you know what they do? They take Achan out, and they take his family out. They take all the possessions that Achan has. They take Achan out, and his family out, and you know what they do? They stone them. They burn them. They do what? They bury him, a heap of rock over him. Get rid of everything that was his, as if Achan were never existed. In Joshua, the 8th chapter, then, Joshua leads the children of Israel. 30,000 soldiers take. And basically what they do is they pull the folks out. And then they ambush them out of Ai. But victory is theirs. And so all of a sudden, the land which they'd come in thinking we're going to win, everything's going to be all right. All of a sudden they reach an obstacle. God tells them how to handle the obstacle. They handle the obstacle and they move on. But it's a great lesson on learning how to move forward in life. As we see that story, there are several things that come to mind. First of all, don't let your yesterday doom, and don't let it overtake today. Think about the story. Think about the story of Joshua leading the children of Israel, and think about it from this standpoint. They had won Jericho, but now at Ai they're defeated. Now what could they do? Well, Joshua just wants to sit back and say, oh, Lord, it's your fault. If we'd just been happy, and not only if we'd just been happy, but you've basically just let us out here die. If they just sat in what was, they'd have been defeated. Israel would have never moved forward. How often do we let our yesterdays doom our todays? How often do we let what we should have done or what we could have done affect what we do today? How often do we think back of yesteryear and we just simply put, can't get past it? The truth is, life doesn't always go the way we planned it, does it? Think back 30 years ago. What were your plans 30 years ago, or 20 years ago, or 10 years ago? What were your plans? Oh, here were my plans when I got out of college. Here were my plans when I had my first baby. Here were my plans. And we learn that plans change, don't they? They don't always go. Life doesn't always go like what we want it to do. That's true of all of us. Do you think Jesus liked for folks to call him a blasphemer? Do you think that Jeremiah in the Old Testament liked to be thrown in a cistern, to be laughed at, to be made fun of? Do you think David liked, after he came back as really a hero, that he had defeated the giant Goliath, the fact that Saul hunted him like a dog for many years? Do you think that Amos really thought he would be a prophet of God? Do you think that Peter really thought about moving forward and, as we'll see in a few minutes, really being important in the early church? Do you think that was part of their plans? Do you think, as you go through just thinking of biblical individuals that show up in the Bible, that do you think that some of those things that were in their, that happened in their life, that were in their life, were really planned, that was part of their plan, that was part of their 10-year plan, part of their 20-year plan, part of their 30-year plan? No. That there were some detours along the way? Yeah. You know, everything just doesn't go the way we want it to. There's little miscues, little things that happen. Church bloopers are some of the greatest things that you'll find. There's a congregation out in Midland, Texas called Golf Course Road Church of Christ. Back several years ago, Firm Foundation had an advertisement for the Golf Course Road Church of Christ. And instead of Golf Course Road, it was called God's Course Road Church of Christ. There's another blooper in a church bulletin once that read this way: "Don't let worry kill you. Let the church help you." Think about that one for a minute. Probably my best blooper, not that I did, but somebody else did. Sermons for Sunday. AM, Jesus walking on the water. PM, searching for Jesus. You know, you've seen them. You've seen signs that didn't read right. Did you see the one where the barbershop had a sign out front? Instead of Happy New Year, it said Happy New Ear? You know, you've seen those things. Well, that's life, isn't it? That's the way life goes. That life does not always head in the direction that we want it to head. That life just doesn't meet up with the expectations that we had. And so we have a choice. Do we live in the old, or do we move forward in the new? You know, when you think about what God has really done for us, He's given us new beginnings, hasn't He? Paul would write in 2 Corinthians chapter 5 and verse 17 that if any man is in Christ, he's a new creation, new creature. You see, when we become New Testament children of God, what do? We begin again, don't we? We start over, if you will. We start fresh. We're new. And that newness then continues, doesn't it? 1 John 1 verse 7, that as we walk in the light with Him, His blood, Christ's blood that is, cleanses us from all unrighteousness. We're still new. We're renewed day by day. To think that we can, as individuals, start a new life. But not only is there newness, if you will, in becoming New Testament children of God, but there's newness that's day by day. In Lamentations chapter 3, we're reminded that it's because of the Lord's mercies that we are not consumed. They, talking about, if you go back to the context, blessings, they are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. And so, when we ask God, give us this day our daily bread, we understand that we live in many ways day by day. We need to learn that lesson. That as we move forward in life, how are we going to move forward? We're going to move forward by not letting yesterday consume what is today. Don't live in the past. Don't live what used to be, how it used to be, how we used to do. It's over. It's done. What did Paul say in Philippians 3? Forgetting the things that are behind. And Paul had a lot to forget about with regards to the things that were behind, didn't he? In the context there of Philippians 3, Paul's talking about being a Jew of Jews. Boy, there was nobody, he says, that was a better Jew than I was. But Paul said, I gave it all up. I forgot the things that are behind. I gave all of that up for the cause of Christ. And so I forgot those things. I forgot those things that I did. The persecuting of Christians, the stoning of Christians. I forgot those things. I did not let those things hold me back. I did not let those things hold me down. I did not let those things hold on to me. What's past is past. What's done is done. What's gone is gone. And so we learn that great lesson that we need to move forward in life. We can't sit back and think about what was, but we can think about what will be, and definitely what is. But then the second lesson that we learn is that we really need to fix our mistakes. God told Joshua that if you don't get the sin in your camp out of your camp, you can't move forward. You see, in life, we often want to stay right where we are, don't we? We really, moving forward sometimes just seems like it's not an option in our life. We just soon stay where we are as opposed to move forward. We just soon stay like everything is instead of fixing what it is. Our son is in the process of moving. He's bought a different house, moving from one town to another because of his choice of jobs. And so in his moving and in buying the house, we were talking, he said, "Oh, I got to fix this, this, and this." And he said, "It's been there ever since I bought the house. I just never have fixed it." You see, he was happy where he was, what he had, and so he wasn't willing to change it. But now the people that are buying the house, guess what? They want it fixed. And so he's having to fix those things. How many of us have been there? Sure, we all have. But in the story of Joshua and the children of Israel, Achan had to be taken care of because Achan hadn't done what he was supposed to do. Achan thus had brought up problems really for all the children of Israel. But God said, fix the problem, and so they did. How many of us learn from the past? How many of us really find lessons that we learn from the things that happened in the past in order to grow to be better in the future? Are we individuals that are sure to move forward in that direction? Story is told of two elk hunters. They went out into the deep woods of Canada. The plane flew them in. And the pilot said, "I'll be back in 1 week." And he said, "Each one of you can bring back 1 elk, 2 elk total." And he says, "Because more weight than that, we can't get out of this valley here. I can't get the plane high enough to be too much weight." And so they had a week that they thoroughly enjoyed. They were there at the runway waiting for the plane, and it came to get them on the day that they had agreed upon. And so the pilot gets out of the plane and he says, "What's this?" And they said, "Well, that's our elk." And he said, "What's that?" And they said, "Well, that's our elk. You told us we could take back elk." And he said, "I told you could take back 2, 1 each." "And how many's there?" And they said, "Well, there's 4. There's 2 each." And he said, "I told you could only take back 2. And they said, "Well, we had a pilot last year. We did this. We did it last year. We carried 4 back. And if he can get us out here, you can get us out here. He's not any better than you are." And so the pilot thought for a minute. He said, "Okay." And so they piled the 4 elk into the plane. The hunters get into the plane. The pilot gets in the plane revs up, begins to take off. It crashes because too much weight. It couldn't make it out of the valley. But thankfully, all survived the crash. And as the 2 hunters came out of the crash, one looked at the other and said, "Well, where are we?" And the second one looked at the first and he says, "Well," and he looked around, "best I can tell, we're about 2 miles east of where we were last year when we crashed, trying to get out of here." Some folks just don't learn from the past. Some folks don't fix their mistakes. But we need to be individuals that learn to fix our mistakes. Paul talked about in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. He says, "When I was a child, I spoke as a child. I understand as a child. I thought as a child. But then you remember what he says next? But I put away childish things. The Hebrew writer said it this way in Hebrews chapter 12. Seeing we are compassed about with so great a cloud of witnesses, let us lay aside every weight and the sin which does so easily beset us. Did you hear what he said? He says, we laid aside the burdens that were holding us back. We laid aside the things that were holding us back and keeping us from progressing and moving forward. The things that were holding us back so that we could not move on in our life. We forgot those things. We laid them aside. We had nothing to do with them. We didn't want them. We wanted to move on. In Christianity, we call that repentance, don't we? It's the idea of putting off the old man of Colossians chapter 3 and verse 10 and putting on the new man. It's the idea of past sins and past faults, of leaving them behind and putting them off and saying, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to live that way. That's not going to be part of my life anymore. As we strive to put on Jesus Christ and to reflect His image, to change into His image, 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18, that we may be like Him. We put off those things in the past. We put off those weights, those things that hinder us, those things that stop us. We fix our mistakes. We fix the past in order to move forward. And until we learn to fix those things, we can't move forward. For we're sort of like the individual, the man that always prayed in church. He said, Lord, he said, we're not making much progress, but thank you for where we are. And finally, one day, one man that had really gotten fed up with that brother saying that in church noticed in town this man stuck in his vehicle. He was in a rut. He couldn't get out. And so this brother that was tired of the brother that had said this for so often in the prayers that he led went up to his car and he said, well, brother, he said, it looks like you're not making progress, but at least be thankful for where you are. That's not life. Life is about growth. It's about moving forward. Because while Paul forgot the things that were behind, what did he say in Philippians 3? He said, I press. I move forward. I move forward in my life. And so you fix your mistakes in the past. But then, third lesson that we learn, really long before the Japanese ever made this proverb, but yet the proverb itself is so true. If you fall down 7 times, get up 8. Think about this story. Think about Joshua and Caleb. Think about the fact that they were knocked down. Joshua was, as he was leading the children of Israel, but he got back up. Think about the children of Israel. When they got rid of the sin in the camp, when they fixed the mistake, what did they do? They moved forward. What were they able to do? Chapter 8, they won. They got up when they were knocked down. You ever been knocked down in life? Just about all of us could say yes. At one time or another, we got knocked down in life. Don't tell them what it was. Maybe it was the loss of a job. Maybe it was the loss of a mate. Maybe it was the loss of parents. Maybe it was the loss of health. Maybe it was the loss of a loved one. Whatever it might have been. Maybe it was a financial setback. Maybe it was a setback with regards to your goals. Who knows? You do. But what'd you do? Did you sit there and say, well, man, I had a good idea? Or I had a plan that was out of this world. Or did you sit back and say, boy, everything was going good until... You see, when life hands you lemons, what do? You make lemonade, right? You move forward. What do? Well, that means simply put that when you get knocked down, you get back up. I want you to think about a Bible character for a minute, if you don't mind. The Bible character is a man by the name of Peter. Peter was one that Jesus had chosen to be one of his apostles. Peter was an individual that Jesus loved. Within the 12, there seems to be, if you will, maybe an even more smaller circle of folks that Jesus maybe even coddled a little bit more, and Peter was one of those. But in Luke 22, in the last hours of Jesus' life, Jesus told Peter, he said, Peter, you're going to deny me. Oh, Lord, no, not me. I will never deny you. I'll never leave you nor forsake you. And Jesus says, before the cock crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. You can look in Matthew 26. You can look in Luke 22. You'll see the story. You know it as well as I. Sure enough, before the cock crows, Peter denies the Lord. Move forward. Keep moving forward with me. Peter denies the Lord. Jesus is crucified. Not many hours after this, he dies. He is placed in a tomb. He comes up forth out of that tomb. And we don't have a lot about what he did after that, from that time until the ascension, but we have a little bit. And John 21 clues us in a little bit about Peter. There's a discussion between Jesus and Peter about, Peter, do you love me? And there's always been, sermons have been preached on the difference between the agape and the phileo, and there's not as much distinction in the Greek as we preachers have made it out, but there is a small distinction there. But Jesus basically asked Peter, Peter, how much do you love me? Do you really love me? Are you committed to me? And, well, Lord, you know I kind of love you. Feed my lambs. Peter, do you love me? Do you have that wholehearted commitment, love? Well, Lord, you know, I love you. Feed my sheep. Peter, do you love me? Do you love me just a little bit? Yeah, Lord, that's pretty much the way I love you. Well, Lord, we'll feed my sheep. That 3-pronged question with 3-pronged answer has led many of us to believe that Jesus is simply reminding Peter of when he denied the Lord 3 times. Peter didn't need to be reminded. Peter already knew about what he had done. But now go forward some 52 days. The apostles are together in an assembly, if you will, in an upper room. They've been together, though. They're in an assembly. It's Pentecost. Each one of the apostles has this cloven tongues of fire that lands upon them. And each speaks in a tongue, a language, not an unknown, unscripted idea, but simply put, a language that they had been endowed by God through His Spirit to speak in a language that they had not studied. It would be much like if I were to all of a sudden speak in French. I can't speak in French. I hadn't had the first class in French. And so if you say something to me and you really don't want me to know what you're saying, say it in French. I won't have a clue. These fellows spoke in languages which they did not know. They spoke what was intelligible to the people because they understood as they heard their own language being spoken. The one that takes the lead on that day, the one, that sermon we really know about, and I believe they all probably preached the same sermon. I can't prove that text-wise, but I still believe it. The one, though, that we see leading the pack is the guy that had that 3-pronged question put to him about how much do you love me? It was the same guy that had denied the Lord 3 times. It was the same guy that Jesus had loved. All of a sudden now in Acts chapter 2, He's able to preach the first gospel sermon. And then in Acts 3 and in Acts 4, we keep reading. As we're reading, we keep finding the same guy's name, Peter. And then as we keep reading our New Testament, if we're going from front to back, if you will, we get to a book by the name of 1 Peter. And guess who that is? That's Peter. It's the same guy. And then we get to the 5th chapter of that great book of 1 Peter. We get to verse 4. And what do we find out? Peter's an elder in the church. How did he go from a guy that would not even admit that he knew the Lord to a guy that's an elder in the church? I simply believe he didn't let yesterday get him down. He forgot, as he corrected his mistakes, he forgot those things. And he got up one more time when he was knocked down. You see, we need to learn that lesson. We need to understand that we're going to get knocked down in life, that there are going to be times in which we're going to need to get back up. We're going to need to move forward. And how do we move forward? By not just getting knocked down, but by getting up. Our sufficiency, Paul wrote in 2 Corinthians 3, verse 5, is not of ourselves, it's God. And if our sufficiency is of God, then we need to lean upon God. You see, we could have been like we studied here a few weeks ago, 1 Samuel, the 30th chapter. David got knocked down, but David got up. Elijah, in 1 Kings 17th chapter, got knocked down, but he got up. Our beloved Paul of the New Testament, in 2 Corinthians 11th chapter, talks about all the different times he got knocked down, but he kept getting back up. It's all right to get knocked down. It's not getting knocked down that's the problem. It's whether you get back up. Now, you might say, well, preacher, it's going to take some help, and it's going to take some folks being of assistance to me, because I can't do this. That's right, you can't. And it is going to take one another. But how do you move forward in life? You forget the past. You get rid of the mistakes. And you get up. But how are you going to win? How are you going to win? Isn't it interesting that in Joshua, the 8th chapter, there's a great point in which God said to Joshua, raise up your sword. And when he raised up his sword, the whole plan of Joshua 8 comes into effect, how that people were led out of the town and then they were basically ambushed by the children of Israel. And victory was theirs, just as God had promised. How are you going to get through life? How are you going to be victorious? Being on God's side. Abraham Lincoln was once asked in a little press conference, how do you know that God's on your side? And he said, well, I don't. But I know that the most important thing is not whether God's on my side, but whether I'm on God's side. And I choose to be on God's side. You're going to get knocked down in life. You're going to be knocked back. And you're going to wonder how to progress forward. In Joshua chapter 7 and Joshua chapter 8 gives you a beautiful picture. With the promise being in the end, victory. It may not be exactly like you want, but you'll be able to move forward because God has promised in holding us, He'll carry us through. This morning, if you're not a New Testament child of God, or you're an individual that needs to rededicate your life, our prayer is that you'll come. While together we stand and sing.